back to The Great Gatsby. Today we'll be reading Chapter 4. If you're trying to go to sleep, then go ahead and get comfortable and close your eyes. If you're just trying to relax, maybe close your eyes, maybe start working on something, or, just listen. Anyways, let's get right into it. On Sunday morning, white church bells rang in the villages along the shore of the world, and its mistress returned to Gatsby's house and twinkled hilariously on his lawn. "He's a bootlegger," said the young ladies, moving somewhere between his cocktails and his flowers. "One time he killed a man who had found out that he was nephew to von Hindenburg and second cousin to the devil. Reach me a rose, honey, and pour me a last drop into that there crystal glass." Once I wrote down on the empty spaces of a timetable the names of those who came to Gatsby's house that summer. It is an old timetable now, disintegrating at its folds, and headed "This schedule in effect July 5th, 1922. But I can still read the gray names, and they will give you a better impression than my generalities of those who accepted Gatsby's hospitality and paid him the subtle tribute of knowing nothing whatever about it. From Eastake, then, came the Chester Beckers and the Leaches, and a man named Bunsen, who I knew at Yale, and Dr. Webster Civet, who drowned last summer up in Maine, and the Hornbeams, and the Willie Voltaires, and a whole clan named Buckbeak, who always gathered in a corner and flipped up their noses like goats at whoever came near, and the Ismays and the Christies, or rather, Hubert and Mr. Christie's wife, and Edgar Beaver, whose hair they say turned cotton white one afternoon for no good reason at all. Clarence Endive was from Eastake, as I remember. He only came once in white knickerbockers and had a fight with a bum named Eddie in the garden. From farther out on the island came the Cheadles and the O.R.P. Schraders, and the Stonewall Jackson Abrams of Georgia, and the Fishguards and the Ripley Snells. Snell was there on 3 days before he went to the penitentiary, so drunk out on the gravel drive that Mrs. Ulysses Sweat's automobile ran over his right hand. The Danceys came too, and S.B. Whitebait, who was well over 60, and Maurice A. Flink, and the Hammerheads, and Beluga the tobacco importer, and the Beluga's girls. From West Egg came the Pulls and the Mulreadys, and Cecil Roebuck, and Cecil Schoen, and Golick, the state senator, and Newton Orchard, who controlled films par excellence, and Exhaust, and Clyde Cohen, and Don S. Schwartz, the son, and Arthur McCarty, all connected with the movies one way or another. And the Catlips, and the Bembergs, and G. Earl Muldoon, brother to that Muldoon who afterwards strangled his wife. Da Fontano, the promoter, came there, and Ed Legros, and James B. Rotgut Barrett, and the Dejongs, and Ernest Lilly. They came to gamble, and when Ferret wandered into the garden, it meant he was cleaned out, and the associated attraction would have to fluctuate profitably the next day. A man named Klipspringer was there so often and so long that he became known as the Boarder. I doubt if he had any other home. Of theatrical people there was Gus Ways, and Horace O'Donovan, and Lester Meyer, and George Duckweed, and Francis Bull. Also from New York were the Crones, and the Backhausens, and Denneckers, and Russell Betty, and the Corrigans, and the Kellers, and the Dewars, and the Scullies, and S.W. Bletcher, and the Smirks, and the Young Quins, divorced now, and Henry L. Palmetto, who killed himself by jumping in front of a subway train in Times Square. Benny McClenhan had always arrived with 4 girls. They were never quite the same ones in physical person, but they were so identical with another that it inevitably seemed like they had been there before. I have forgotten their names. Jack Clinton, I think. Or else Consuela, Gloria, Judy, or June, and their last names were either the melodious names of flowers and months, or the sterner ones of the great American capitalists whose cousins, if pressed, they would confess themselves to be. In addition to all these, I can remember that the Faustania O'Brien came there at least once, and the Bedecker girls, and young Brewer, who had his nose shot off in the war, and Mr. Albruxberger, and Miss Hag, his fiancée, and Ardita Fitzpeters, and Mr. P. Jewett, once head of the American Legion, Miss Claudia Hip, with a man reputed to be her chauffeur, and a prince of something whom we called Duke, and whose name, if I ever knew it, I have forgotten. All these people came to Gatsby's house in the summer. At 9 o'clock one morning late in July, Gatsby's gorgeous car lurched up the rocky drive to my door and gave out a burst of a melody from its three-knotted horn. It was the first time he had called on me, though. I had gone to 2 of his parties, mounted in his hydroplane, and at his urgent invitation made frequent use of his beach. "Good morning, old sport. You're having lunch with me today, and I thought we'd ride up together." He was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with that resourcefulness of movement that is so peculiarly American. That comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting work or rigid sitting in youth, and even more with the formless grace of our nervousness sporadic games. This quality was continually breaking through his punctilious manner in the shape of restlessness. He was never quite still. There was always a tapping foot somewhere or the impatient opening and closing of a hand. He saw me looking with admiration at his car. "It's pretty, isn't it, old sport?" He jumped off to give me a better view. "Haven't you ever seen it before?" I'd seen it. Everybody had seen it. It was a rich cream color, bright with nickel, swollen here and there in its monstrous length with triumphant hat boxes and supper boxes and toolboxes, and terraced with a labyrinth of windshields that mirrored a dozen suns. Sitting down behind me, many layers of glass in a sort of green leather conservatory, we started to town. I had talked with him perhaps half a dozen times in the past month, and found, to my disappointment, that he had little to say. So my first impression that he was a person of some undefined consequence had gradually faded, and he had simply become the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door. And then came that disconcerting ride. We hadn't reached Westegg Village before Gatsby began leaving his elegant sentences unfinished and slapping himself indecisively on the knee of his caramel-colored suit. "Look here, old sport," he broke out surprisingly. "What's your opinion of me, anyhow?" A little overwhelmed, I began the generalized evasions which that question deserves. "Well, I'm going to tell you something about my life," he interrupted. "I don't want you to get the wrong idea of me from all those stories you hear." So he was aware of the bizarre accusations that flavored conversation in his halls. "I'll tell you God's truth," his right hand suddenly ordered divine retribution to stand by. "I am the son of some wealthy people in the Middle East, all dead now. I was brought up in America, but educated at Oxford because all my ancestors had been educated there for many years. It's a family tradition." He looked at me sideways, and I knew why Jordan Baker had believed he was lying. He hurried the phrase "educated at Oxford," or swallowed it or choked on it as though it had bothered him before. And with this doubt, his whole statement fell to pieces, and I wondered if there wasn't something a little sinister about him after all. "What part of the Middle West?" I inquired casually. "San Francisco." "I see. My family all died, and I came into a good deal of money." His voice was sullen, as if the memory of that sudden extinction of a clan had still haunted him. For a moment I suspected that he was pulling my leg, but a glance at him convinced me otherwise. "After that, I lived like a young Raja in all the capitals of Europe, Paris, Venice, Rome, collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, hunting big game, painting a little, things for myself only, and trying to forget something very sad that happened to me long ago." With an effort, I managed to restrain my incredulous laughter. The very phrases were worn so threadbare that they evoked no image except that of a turbaned character leaking sawdust at every pore as he pursued a tiger through Bois de Boulogne. Then came the war, old sport. It was a great relief, and I tried very hard to die, but I seemed to bear an enchanted life. I accepted a commission as first lieutenant when it began. It was the Argonne Forest. I took 2 machine-gun detachments so far forward that there was a half-mile gap on either side of us where the infantry couldn't advance. We stayed there 2 days and 2 nights, 130 men with 16 Lewis guns, and when the infantry came up at last, they found the insignia of 3 German divisions among the piles of dead. I was promoted to be a major, and every Allied government gave me a decoration, even Montenegro, little Montenegro down on the Adriatic Sea. Little Montenegro. He lifted up the words and nodded at them with a smile. The smile comprehended Montenegro's troubled history and sympathized with the brave struggles of the Montenegrin people. It appreciated fully the chain of national circumstances which had elicited this tribute from Montenegro's warm little heart. My incredulity was submerged in fascination now. It was like skimming hastily through a dozen magazines. He reached into his pocket, and a piece of metal slung on a ribbon fell into my palm. That's the one from Montenegro. To my astonishment, the thing had an authentic look. Ordi Dinalo, ran the circular legend, Montenegro Nicholas Rex. Turn it. Major J. Gatsby, for valor extraordinary. Here's another thing I once carried, a souvenir of my Oxford days. It was taken in Trinity Quad. The man on my left is now the Earl of Dorchester. It was a photograph of half a dozen young men in blazers loafing in an archway, through which were a visible host of spires. There was Gatsby, looking a little, not much younger, with a cricket bat in his hand. Then it was all true. I saw the skins of tigers flaming in his palace in the Grand Canal. I saw him opening a chest of rubies to ease, with their crimson lightened depths, the gnawings of his broken heart. I'm going to make a big request of you today, he said, pocketing his souvenirs with satisfaction. So I thought you ought to know something about me. I didn't want you to think I was just nobody. You see, I usually find myself among strangers because I drift here and there, trying to forget the sad thing that happened to me. He hesitated. You'll hear about it this afternoon. At lunch? No, this afternoon. I happened to find out that you're taking Miss Baker to tea. Do you mean you're in love with Miss Baker? No, old sport, I'm not. But Miss Baker has kindly consented to speak to you about this matter. I hadn't the faintest idea what this matter was, but I was more annoyed than interested. I had asked Jordan to tea in order to discuss Mr. J. Gatsby. I was sure the request was to be something utterly fantastic, and for a moment I was sorry I'd ever set foot on his overpopulated lawn. He wouldn't need another word. His correctness grew on him as we neared the city. He passed Port Roosevelt, where there was a glimpse of red-belted ocean-going ships, and sped along a cobbled slum lined with dark, undeserted saloons of the faded, gilt 1900s. Then the Valley of Ashes opened up on both sides, and I had a glimpse of Mrs. Wilson straining at the garage pump with panting vitality as we went by. With fenders spread like wings, we scattered light through half Astoria, only half, for as we twisted among the pillars of the elevated, I heard the familiar jug spat of a motorcycle, and a frantic policeman rode alongside. All right, old sport, called Gatsby. We slowed down. Taking a white card from his wallet, he waited before the man's eyes. Right you are, agreed the policeman, tipping his cap. Know you next time, Mr. Gatsby. Excuse me. What was that? I inquired. The picture of Oxford? I was able to do the commissioner a favor once, and he sends me a Christmas card every year. Over the great bridge, with the sunlight through the girders making a constant flicker upon the moving cars, with the city rising up across the rivers in white heaps, sugar lumps all built with a wish out of non-olfactory money. The city seen from Queensboro Bridge is always the city seen for the first time, in its first wild promise of all mystery and the beauty in the world. A dead man passed us in a hearse heaped with blooms, followed by 2 carriages with drawn blinds, and by more cheerful carriages for friends. The friends looked out at us with tragic eyes and short upper lips of southeastern Europe, and I was glad that the sight of Gatsby's splendid car was included in their somber holiday. As we crossed Blackwell's Island, a limousine passed us, driven by a white chauffeur, in which sat 3 modish Negroes, 2 bucks and a girl. I laughed aloud as the yokes of the rivals rolled towards us in haughty rivalry. Anything can happen now that we've slid over this bridge, I thought. Anything at all. Even Gatsby could happen, without any particular wonder. Roaring noon, in a well-fanned 42nd Street cellar, I met Gatsby for lunch. Blinking away the brightness of the street outside, my eyes picked him out obscurely in the ante-room, talking to another man. Mr. Carroway, this is my friend Mr. Wolfsheim. A small, flat-nosed Jew raised his large head and regarded me with 2 fine growths of hair, which luxuriated in either nostril. After a moment, I discovered his tiny eyes in the half-darkness. So I took one look at him, said Mr. Wolfsheim, shaking my head earnestly. And what do you think I did? What? I inquired politely. But evidently he was not addressing me, for he dropped my hand and covered Gatsby with his expressive nose. I handed the money to Catspaw, and I said, All right, Catspaw, Don't pay him a penny till he shuts his mouth. He shouted then and there. Gatsby took an arm of each of us and moved forward into the restaurant, whereupon Mr. Wolfsheim swallowed a new sentence he was starting and lapsed into some ambulatory abstraction. "Highballs?" asked the head waiter. "This is a nice restaurant here," said Mr. Wolfsheim, looking at the Presbyterian nymphs on the ceiling, "but I like across the street better." "Yes, highballs," agreed Gatsby, and then to Mr. Wolfsheim, "It's too hot over there." "Hot and small, yes, Mr. Wolfsheim, but full of memories." "What place is that?" I asked. The old Metropole, brooded Mr. Wolfsheim gloomily, filled with faces dead and gone, with friends gone now and forever. "I can't forget so long as I live the night they shot Rosie Rosanthal there. It was 6 of us at the table, and Rosie had ate and drank all evening. When it was almost morning, the waiter came up to him with a funny look and said somebody wants to speak to him outside. "All right," says Rosie, and begins to get up, and I pulled him down into his chair. "Let the bastards come in here if they want you, Rosie, but don't you, so help me move outside this room." It was 4 o'clock in the morning then, and if we'd raised the blinds, we'd have seen daylight. "Did he go?" I asked innocently. "Sure he went." Mr. Wolfsheim's nose flashed me indignantly. He turned around in the door and says, "Don't let that waiter take away my coffee." Then he went out on the sidewalk, and they shot him 3 times in his full belly and drove away. 4 of them were electrocuted, I said, remembering. 5 with Becker. His nostrils turned to me in an interested way. "I understand you're looking for a business negotiation." The juxtaposition of these 2 remarks was startling. Gatsby answered for me. "Oh no," he exclaimed, "this isn't the man." "No?" Mr. Wolfsheim seemed disappointed. "This is just a friend. I told you we'd talk about that some other time." "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Wolfsheim. "I had a wrong man." A succulent hash arrived, and Mr. Wolfsheim, forgetting the more sentimental atmosphere of the old metropole, began to eat with ferocious delicacy. His eyes, meanwhile, roved very slowly all around the room. He completed the arc by turning to inspect the people directly behind. I think that, except for my presence, he would have taken one short glance beneath our table. "Look here, old sport," said Gatsby, leaning toward me. "I'm afraid I made you a little angry in this morning in the car." There was the smile again, but this time I held out against it. "I don't like mysteries," I answered, "and I don't understand why you won't come out frankly and tell me what you want. Why has it all got to go through Miss Baker?" "Oh, it's nothing underhand," he assured me. "Miss Baker is a great sportswoman, you know, and she'd never do anything that wasn't all right." Suddenly, he looked at his watch, jumped up, and hurried from the room, leaving me with Mr. Wolfsheim at the table. "He has to telephone Mr. Wolfsheim," following him with his eyes. "A fine fellow, isn't he? Handsome to look at and a perfect gentleman." "Yes. He's an Oxford man." "Oh. He went to Oxford College in England. You know Oxford College?" "I've heard of it. It's one of the most famous colleges in the world." "Have you known Gatsby for a long time?" I inquired. "Several years," he answered in a gratified way, "but I made the pleasure of his acquaintance just after the war. But I knew I had discovered a man of fine breeding after I talked with him an hour. I said to myself, there's the kind of man you'd like to take home and introduce to your mother and sister." He paused. "I see you're looking at my cuff buttons." I hadn't been looking at them, but I did now. They were composed of oddly familiar pieces of ivory. Finest specimens of human molars, he informed me. "Well," I inspected them, "that's a very interesting idea." "Yeah," he flipped his sleeves up under his coat. "Yeah, Gatsby's very careful about women. He would never so much as look at a friend's wife." When the subject of this instinctive trust returned to the table and sat down, Mr. Wolfsheim drank his coffee with a jerk and got to his feet. "I've enjoyed my lunch," he said, "and I'm going to run off from you 2 young men before I outstay my welcome." "Don't hurry, Meyer," said Gatsby without enthusiasm. Mr. Wolfsheim raised his head in some sort of benediction. "You're very light, but I belong to another generation," announced still solemnly. "You sit here and discuss your sports and your young ladies and your—" He supplied an imaginary noun in another wave of his hand. "As for me, I am 50 years old. I won't impose myself on you any longer." As he shook hands and turned away, his tragic nose was trembling. I wondered if I had said anything to offend him. He becomes very sentimental sometimes, explained Gatsby. This is one of his sentimental days. He's quite a character around New York. A denizen of Broadway. Who is he, anyhow? An actor? No. A dentist? Mayor Wolfsheim? No, he's a gambler. Gatsby hesitated, then added coolly, he's the man who fixed the World Series back in 1919. Fixed the World Series, I repeated. The idea staggered me, and I remembered, of course, that the World Series had been fixed in 1919, but if I had thought of it at all, I would have thought of it as the thing that merely happened, the end of some inevitable chain. It never occurred to me that one man could start to play with the faith of 50 million people, with the single-mindedness of a burglar blowing a safe. How did he do that? I asked, after a minute. He just saw the opportunity. Why isn't he in jail? They can't get him, old sport. He's a smart man. I insisted on paying the check. As the waiter brought my change, I caught sight of Tom across the crowded room. Come along with me for a minute. I've got to say hello for someone, or to someone. When he saw us, Tom jumped up and took half a dozen steps in our direction. Where have you been? He demanded eagerly. Daisy's furious because you haven't called up. This is Mr. Gatsby, Tom. They shook hands briefly, and a strained, unfamiliar look of embarrassment came over Gatsby's face. How have you been, anyhow? Demanded Tom of me. How do you happen to come up this far to eat? I've been having lunch with Mr. Gatsby. I turned toward Mr. Gatsby, but he was no longer there. One October day in 1917, said Jordan Baker that afternoon, sitting up very straight on a straight chair in the tea garden at the Plaza Hotel, I was walking along from one place to another, on the sidewalks and half on the lawns. I was happier on the lawns because I had on shoes from England with rubber knobs on the soles that bit into the soft ground. I had on a new plaid skirt, also that blew a little in the wind. Whenever this happened, the red, white, and blue banners in front of all the houses stretched out stiff and said tut, 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 tut in a disapproving way. The largest of the banners and the largest of the lawns belonged to Daisy Faye's house. She was just 18, 2 years older than me, and by far the most popular of all the young girls in Louisville. She dressed in white and had a little white roadster. All day long, the telephone rang in her house and excited young officers from Camp Taylor demanded the privileges of monopolizing her that night. Anyways, for the hour. When I came opposite her house that morning, her white roadster was beside the curb, and she was sitting in it with a lieutenant I had never seen before. They were so engrossed in each other that she didn't see me until I was 5 feet away. Hello, Jordan, she called unexpectedly. Please come here. I was flattered that she wanted to speak to me, because of all the older girls, I admired her the most. She asked me if I was going to the Red Cross and make some bandages. I was. Well, then would I tell them that she couldn't come in that day? The officer looked at Daisy while she was speaking, in a way that every girl wants to be looked at sometime, and because it seemed romantic to me, I have remembered that incident ever since. His name was Jay Gatsby, and I didn't lay eyes on him again for over 4 years. Even after I'd met him again on Long Island, I didn't even realize it was the same man. That was 1917. By the next year, I had a few beaux myself, and began to play in tournaments. I didn't see Daisy very often. She went with a slightly older crowd. When she went out with anyone at all, wild rumors were circulating about her. How her mother had found her packing her bag one winter night to go to New York and say goodbye to a soldier who was going overseas. She was effectually prevented, but she wasn't on speaking terms with her family for several weeks, and she didn't play around with the soldiers anymore, but only with a few flat-footed, short-sighted young men in town who couldn't get into the army at all. By the next autumn, she was gay again, gay as ever. She had a debut in the armistice, and in February she was presumably engaged to a man from New Orleans. In June, she married Tom of Chicago with more pomp and circumstance than Louisville ever knew before. He came down with 100 people in 4 private cars and hired a whole floor of the Sealback Hotel. And the day before the wedding, he gave her a string of pearls valued at $350. I was bridesmaid. I came into her room half an hour before the bridal dinner and found her lying on her bed as lovely as June night in her flower dress, and as drunk as a monkey. She had a bottle of Sonorine in one hand and a letter in the other. Congratulate me, she muttered. Never had a drink before, but oh, how I do enjoy it. What's the matter, Daisy? I was scared, I can tell you. I had never seen a girl like that before. Here, dearest. She groped around in a lace package she had with her on the bed and pulled out the string of pearls. Take them downstairs and give them back to whoever they belong to. Tell them all Daisy's changed her mind. Say, Daisy's changed her mind. She began to cry. She cried and cried. I rushed out and found her mother's maid, and we locked the door and got her into a cold bath. She wouldn't let go of the letter. She took it into the tub with her and squeezed it up into a wet ball, and only let me leave it in the soap dish when she saw that it was coming to pieces like snow. But she didn't say another word. We gave her spirits of ammonia and put ice on her forehead, and hooked her back into her dress. Half an hour later, when we walked out of the room, the pearls were around her neck, and the incident was over. Next day at 5 o'clock, she married Tom without so much as a shiver and started off 3 months' trip to the South Seas. I saw him in Santa Barbara when they came back, and I thought I'd never seen a girl so mad about her husband. If he left the room for a minute, she'd look around uneasily and say, "Where's Tom gone?" and wear the most abstracted expression until she saw him coming through the door. She used to sit on the sand with his head in her lap by the hour, rubbing her fingers over his eyes and looking at him with unfathomable delight. It was touching to see them together. It made you laugh in a hushed, fascinated way. That was in August. A week after I left Santa Barbara, Tom ran into a wagon on the Ventura Road one night and ripped a front wheel off his car. The girl who was with him got into the papers too because her arm was broken. She was one of the chambermaids in the Santa Barbara hotel. The next April, Daisy had her little girl and they went to France for a year. I saw them one spring in Cannes and later in Deauville, and they came back to Chicago to settle down. Daisy was popular in Chicago, as you know. They moved with a fast crowd, all of them young, rich, and wild, but she came out with an absolutely perfect reputation, perhaps because she didn't drink. It's a great advantage not to drink among hard-drinking people. You can hold your tongue, and moreover, you can time any little irregularity of your own so that everybody else is blind, that they don't see or don't care. Perhaps Daisy never went in for a more at all, and yet there's something in that voice of hers. Well, about 6 weeks ago, she heard the name Gatsby for the first time in years. It was when I asked you, do you remember? If you knew Gatsby in West Egg after you had gone home, she came into my room and woke me up and said, "What Gatsby?" And when I described him, I was half asleep. She said in the strangest voice that it must be the man she used to know. It wasn't until then that I connected this Gatsby with the officer in her white car. When Jordan Baker had finished telling me all this, we had left the plaza for half an hour and were driving into Victoria through Central Park. The sun had gone down behind the tall apartments of the movie stars in the West 50s, and the clear voices of girls already gathered like crickets on the grass rose through the hot twilight. I'm the Sheik of Arabai. Your love belongs to me. At night when you are asleep, into your tent I'll creep. It was a strange coincidence, I said, but it wasn't a coincidence at all. Why not? Gatsby bought that house so that Daisy would be just across the bay. That it had not been merely the stars to which he had aspired on that June night. He came alive to me, delivered suddenly from the womb of his purposeless splendor. He wants to know, continued Jordan, if you'll invite Daisy to your house in afternoon and then let him come over. The modesty of the demand shook me. He had waited 5 years and bought a mansion where he dispensed starlight to casual moths so that he could come over some afternoon to a stranger's garden. Did I have to know all this before he could ask such a little thing? He's afraid. He's waited so long. He thought you might be offended. You see, he's a regular tough underneath it all. Something worried me. Why didn't he ask you to arrange a meeting? He wants her to see his house, and your house is right next door. Oh, I think he half expected her to wander into one of his parties some night, but she never did. Then he began asking people casually if they knew her, and it was the first one he had found. It was that night he sent for me at his dance, and you should have heard the elaborate way he worked up to it. Of course, I immediately suggested a luncheon at New York, and I thought he'd go mad. I don't want to do anything out of the way, he kept saying. I want to see her right next door. When I said you were a particular friend of Tom's, he started to abandon the whole idea. He doesn't know very much about Tom, though he says he's read a Chicago paper for years just on the chance of catching a glimpse of Daisy's name. It was dark now, and as we dipped under a little bridge, I put my arm on Jordan's golden shoulder and drew her toward me and asked her to dinner. Suddenly, I wasn't thinking of Daisy and Gatsby anymore, but of this clean, hard, limited person who dealt in universal skepticism and who'd leaned back jauntily just within the circle of my arm. A phrase began to beat in my ears with a sort of heady excitement. There are only the pursued, the pursuing, and the busy, and the tired. And Daisy ought to have something in her life, murmured Jordan to me. Does she want to see Gatsby? She's not to know about it. Gatsby doesn't want her to know. You're just supposed to invite her to tea. We passed a barrier of dark trees, and then the facade of 59th Street. A block of delicate, pale light beamed down into the park. Unlike Gatsby and Tom, I had no idea whose girl whose disembodied face floated along the dark cornices in blinding sights, and so I drew up the girl beside me, tightening my arms. Her wan, scornful mouth smiled, and so I drew her up again, closer this time to my face. And that's chapter 4. Oh man, so these last 2 chapters have been just great. And this one was a little less heavy on the imagery, but I think that's fine because we finally know Gatsby's purpose. Before this chapter, we had no idea what he wanted. He seemed to have it all, yet he didn't seem to be very satisfied. He almost seemed to be looking for something. He was never quite happy with his guest. He wouldn't participate with them in any way. No women would come and fawn over Gatsby. And now we know why. It's because he has a love interest that has spanned 5 years. And now we know that this is what he has made this entire personality of his for, is just to get Daisy to notice him again, to recognize him. It's just honestly a really amazing storyline, and it's such a great plot twist that you just don't expect it. I don't know. I gush over this book every time I finish a chapter, but the first time I read this was back in high school. I'm sure that's probably the first time for a lot of you as well, but it's a book that stuck with me after that. Not just because, it's a classic, but actually because there's so much care put into it. And amazingly, the author of this novel, Fitzgerald, this book was panned on release. It was just disgraceful at the beginning. Like, people didn't love this book at all when it was released, and it was only after his death that people recognized this for the great piece of literature that it is. Yeah, Fitzgerald had very few successful books while he was alive. And it's very sad, but his work is so impactful that it's still here almost a decade later. Actually, more than a decade, almost, yeah. I think it was published in the 20s, so yeah, about a decade. Just think about that. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope if you were trying to sleep, then you are asleep right now. If you weren't and you were just trying to relax, thank you for watching this video. I hope you have a good rest of the day or a good night. See you.